3, 2, and 1.
Welcome to the Board of Education Policy Committee meeting. I call the meeting to order. Ms. King, may I have a roll call, please? Oh, sorry. Welcome to the Board of Education.
You can hear yourselves
You
here.
can hear yourself now. It
Apologize.
was on a read back. Yeah.
Yolanda Montoya Cordova,
Here.
Peggy Miller Aragon, Barbara Peterson, Crystal Tapia Romero,
Here.
Josefina Dominguez, Courtney Jackson,
Here.
Danielle Gonzalez.
Here. The first item on our agenda is approval of the September 18th, 2023 Policy Committee meeting agenda. May I have a motion, please?
I'll move for approval of the September 18th, 2023 Policy Committee meeting agenda.
And do we have a second?
I'll second. This is Courtney.
Great. We have a motion from Board President Montoya Cordova and a second from Member Jackson. And to note for the record that Member Peterson has joined. Ms. King, may we have a roll call vote, please?
Yolanda Montoya Cordova,
Yes.
Peggy Miller Aragon, Barbara Peterson,
Yes.
Crystal Tapia Romero,
Yes.
Josefina Dominguez, Courtney Jackson,
Yes.
Danielle Gonzalez.
Yes. The next item on the agenda is item 3.1, approval of minutes from the Policy Committee meeting of August 7th, 2023. Do we have a motion for approval?
I'll move for approval of the minutes for the policy committee meeting on August 7th, 2023.
Thank you. And a second?
I'll second. Yolanda.
All right. Ms. King, may we have a roll call vote, please?
Yolanda Montoya Cordova,
Yes.
Barbara Peterson,
Yes.
Crystal Tapia Romero,
Yes.
Courtney Jackson,
Yes.
Danielle Gonzalez.
Yes. Moving on to our discussion items. We are on item 4.1 on the agenda, and our first discussion item is our budget policy draft review. For this agenda item, we have two presenters, Ms. Renette Apalaca, who's our Chief Financial Officer, and Ms. Jessica Martinez, who is our Policy Analyst. And I will turn the floor over to you two.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good evening, members of the Board, Superintendent Elder. Tonight, the committee will review a draft of the budget policy that has been developed at the board's request. The Chief Financial Officer has worked with staff to develop a budget policy that will establish a framework for developing, approving, and managing the APS budget. The proposed budget policy also looks at the role of the Finance Committee, budget updates, and financial reports. This is a discussion item and the committee will review the draft and make recommendations. Chief Financial Officer Renette Apalaca is here to tell you a little bit more about the development of the budget policy.
Thank you so much. So earlier this year, the board approved a sample budget policy and asked staff to create something similar for APS. So what we did is we took the sample policy, we looked at districts in the Council of Great City Schools, and we looked at this big old manual of procedures for public school. And we worked on putting together this budget that aligned to the goals and the guardrails and the distribution of resources. So we stand for any question.
Thank you. So just to reiterate, this is an initial discussion. This is a review draft only. So we started pretty high level around the concepts that we want included in a potential policy. So we're going to have a discussion and hopefully get those revisions. Those revisions will be made, and then the policy will come for first review and first read in a subsequent policy committee meeting. There will be opportunity for public input, followed by a second read and a vote of the policy committee before it goes to the full board on the consent agenda. So plenty of opportunity to continue to review, revise, edit, contribute, and also seek feedback from the community. So with that in mind, that this is draft version, I would like to open the floor to any areas of feedback for our two presenters and for the policy.
Board Member Gonzalez, can I jump in? Go ahead. Sorry, did I speak over somebody?
That's okay. Go ahead, Member Tapia Romero.
Thank you. So I had a question. I just wanted to get clarification on the Finance Committee where it talks about that the board will appoint at least 2 members as a finance subcommittee. Is this in addition? Is this like the new committee we're establishing that we're having that next meeting that's coming up in a couple of weeks?
So this is kind of placeholder language until the ad hoc finance review committee meets to determine what actually fits in here. So I think the answer is kind of yes and no. Whatever that committee decides will become what is in here.
Okay, that was my only question on that particular area. So would we continue to still have where I currently chair, or will it now be like a dual role
I think
Well,
that
to be determined?
I think when we have our ad hoc, I'm sorry for jumping in. This is board member Yolanda Montoya Cordova. So I think, member Tapia Romero, when we have the ad hoc committee that's meeting this Wednesday, what's great is that we have this draft language to kind of guide us a little bit in terms of that. I think it's a good first step. It doesn't necessarily mean that's how it's going to play out, but I think it's given us some options to think about. So I was like you, I kind of had a question mark on my face around what does this mean with the committee language, but I think we still have an opportunity to wrestle with it, to figure out what's going to work best for us.
Yeah, and personally, I'm all in favor of, what, if we add more or do what's needed, I just for clarification on my end, I want to make sure I'm on the same page. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Board President Montoya Cordova.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, I wanted to just express some gratitude because I think it's really important for us to have this policy. So thank you, Chair Gonzalez, for bringing this up. And I know that you had pushed for a budget policy, and it makes a lot of sense for us to have that because I don't think we've ever had anything that guides us around the work that we're doing around budget. So I thought it was really good. I think there's definitely some areas that we just have to wrestle with a little bit, because one of the ones that I struggled was on the budget management. And I think it's just timing, because the last paragraph on there where it says the superintendent or designee will present, I put a red mark around mine and now I can't read it, will present a summary of cash disbursements. And the only thing I was worried about that is like, it's always after the fact. And so I was just concerned, but I think when we go into our ad hoc meeting, I know one of the things that I was going to say is like, put yourselves in our shoes as board members, is like, how do we wrestle with what our responsibilities are? What do we do before and what do we do after? So the timing, I think, was one of the issues that I had on that. And then on the next part, on the budgeting approach, the only thing that I was really wrestling with was the sentence where it says, right after college and career readiness, and its guardrail requiring equitable resource allocation. And I mean, I just want to make sure that we have some really good agreement on what the word equitable means there too. So I thought it was well done. I think it's there, but something just was still a little bit amiss for me, but I think we can clarify that in the ad hoc. But I thought it was great. You did a great job of capturing, I think, the essence of all the key work that we have to do. And, I look forward to the meeting on Wednesday.
Both of you, thank you for flagging the connection to the ad hoc finance committee, because part of what that committee is also discussing is what happens in committee, what happens in board, what can happen by consent, and what is required by law to happen in those various settings versus not, which also has implications for what's required in the reporting. So some of the bullets that are listed here may also change. So the law may require that the law may indicate that we're required to receive that information on a monthly basis and review it. That doesn't necessarily mean we have to discuss it in a full board meeting. So as we get into those details, some of the bullets that are on page 3 may also evolve, but appreciate both of you flagging that. And are there other comments or questions? Go ahead.
So, so this is going to be a board policy, so it's sitting with the board. Is that correct? Okay. So what in writing this, then, I know Renette and Jessica, you were part of putting this all together for the board, correct? Okay. Okay. I just wanted to clarify that. The other thing, and I too had flagged about adding that subcommittee, just kind of adding more committees and more time Like how often would they meet? I mean, is this something when we're trying to not meet as often? I know it's only going to be a few people, but that was just a concern to me since we're supposed to be making things go quicker, not have as many meetings. So that was a concern. Then I also had a concern as Madam President did when it came to, the student-based budgeting that I know we're not going to until 2026, when it just says greatest needs with the greatest needs. And so I just want to make sure the greatest needs in one school are going to be different than the greatest needs from one school to another school. So it's like, how are you going to define what greatest needs is? What is that really? And I understand there's going to end up being a formula, et cetera, how to do it. But I want to make sure greatest needs really is about what the needs are at that school and not just based on that they're EL students or that there are lower SES background. And I just want to make sure greatest needs really is focusing on all the kids and what their needs are. So that was just, I don't know if there's a different way to maybe phrase that. And then another question that I had is on the first page, on the bottom paragraph, when it says, I think it's the second to the last sentence, maybe, or the third to the last sentence. It says the board will not approve an operating budget that fails to demonstrate the community input was solicited. So I understand that we are going to get community input and that's something that we want to do, but we can't not approve a budget. I don't know how else to say that, but we can't not approve a budget. We already have it in our guardrails that we're going to do that. That's a non-negotiable. But when we write, the board will not approve. I just don't know if that's the best thing to have in there because we have no choice but to approve a budget or else the school district can't function.
If I can, real quick.
Mhm.
We actually got that sentence out of the PSAB. So that's where that came from.
Yikes.
So, we can definitely work on that in the committee, but I just wanted you to know.
Yeah, I just kind of say that we can't not approve one, and I understand that community input and it has that in there, but we do not know that something might happen and that for some reason something happens and we couldn't get that input for whatever reason. And it's right when we're about ready to approve a budget. That's scary to me. So.
Madam Chair, Member Mueller-Aragon, I think that the intent of the language is just to ensure that the public has an opportunity to review what we're doing. So we can certainly look at the language for something a little less cumbersome.
Okay. That one was the one that kind of was like, ooh, okay. And then the other one and I'm sure I'm totally misunderstanding this one on the budget management on the third paragraph, where it says on the second sentence in the third paragraph, the board may only vote on funding, which I understand, and not vendor selection. So this just speaks to the fact that the board's going to vote, not that we can't be part of an RFP selection committee, because we obviously board members have been on them. So technically you are choosing one whenever we have, and I know that seldom happens, but it has happened a couple of times in the last year. So I don't know.
I think we just need to make a distinction between board services and board and district operations. I think what this is saying is that we are not going to be voting, we're going to be voting on funding, but not on vendor selection for district operations.
And it's the
Yeah,
board
just-
as a whole.
And it is the board that
Not
we
board
may only
members.
vote,
Mhm.
not board members. So
Okay.
if we could just like clarify that. And then the only, let me see if that's all. When it comes to the bullets on the last page, how is this different from current practice? Like, is that basically a lot of what currently happens?
This is.
Okay. I think that's it.
Thank you. Member Peterson?
So I do have a question sort of more global, and actually it may be the same question that board member Mueller-Aragon had, except I'm coming at it from the other perspective in terms of what equity means. And I mean, I certainly agree that, for instance, in a perfect example is El Dorado may not seem like the highest need school in the district. And yet when they were having a crisis with suicides and mental health, the district addressed that by putting the resources in place to develop the wellness room and the things that they needed. So I think that we're not saying that we don't have an obligation to address particular needs at particular time, and it certainly is in line with goal 4. But I think if we go back to the goals and look at goal 1 and goal 2, that actually in fact does guide us, because if our role is in outcomes, we know that there are groups of students who don't have equal outcomes, and that consequently they need equity-based resources rather than equal resources. So, and one of the big discussions that's happened in the past around Title I money, for instance, there was a real debate around portability and whether you should look at the Title I budget and divide it up by student. And so this school has 1% of the Title I money, or Title I students, so it gets 1% of the money. And this school has 100% Title I students. So the issue comes with where's the biggest impact. What it comes down to is, how do schools make impacts? And sometimes it's not student by student. Sometimes it's an investment in the school as a whole to be able to make decisions, like with an extra classroom teacher or whatever. What the portability issue did was sometimes diffuse the ability to really invest in meaningful ways at schools with high number of Title I students. And it was done on the basis of, well, this student deserves every bit as much. And that's true. No one is arguing against making sure that every student has what they need. The issue is, how do we achieve that in a meaningful way? And an example is, there may be I'll make up a number. There might be 20 Title I students at a particular school where overwhelmingly there's not the same level of financial need. And what that does is, those students still receive the benefit of a community that can provide for more for that school. And it comes up in things like the activities fund, the PTA, how many field trips can get financed. And so those 10 students scattered throughout the school receive the benefits of being in a much more affluent community. Whereas other schools, the PTA will never raise enough money to have multiple field trips for every classroom. And so the decision of being able to put more money in a particular school doesn't end up with impact that affects those 10 students in the same way that it would affect the whole school community where those resources reduced. And so I just think that, it is a philosophical question in a way, but it does come down to dollars and cents at the school level. And I do not know that we have a unified board. I have no idea if we were to vote on that. I have no idea how the vote would come out. But I think that it's something that we need to look at and consider as we have this conversation about what does equity really mean when we look at resources directed at a school. So that's more global, philosophical.
Before you move on, if I may, just to draw our attention to this prior sentence. The district will shift to student-based budgeting, and then it defines it, which is a system where dollars follow students based on needs using objective, measurable, and weighted characteristics. So I think that's what we're trying to get at. And there's a formula that exists that ERS is helping with that the state already has. And so I think maybe it's just around reiterating the formula and using words like, I don't know, predefined or determined or something. But acknowledging that there is somewhat of a definition in here already. Okay, so your next comment.
The next one goes back to the Finance Committee. I mean, we all have been elected to have by constituents who expect us to have a certain role in overseeing the district's finances. And I think on this one, I definitely agree with Board Member Mueller-Aragon that we would have the same obligation to raise the same questions, whether we were on the subcommittee or whether we are just sitting on the board. So then my question is, do we actually save, I mean, I think it echoes her concern, does it actually save any time for two people to go through this when it's going to come back and we need to have the same conversation as a whole? I think we have absolutely made progress by having the questions ahead of time. I think we have some very helpful, meaningful new policies or procedures in place to help with that. I'm just not sure if a two-person appointed subcommittee would actually get us any further, because anything substantial, it's still got to come to the board.
So this is it's just placeholder language. So it could say 6-person member. So I think it really is dependent upon what comes out of this ad hoc committee that Member Tapia Romero is chairing. So I think maybe we can go into that meeting with some proposed values statements around how do we develop a process wherein each member is able to maintain their responsibility to their constituents, to review financial data and et cetera, as we also try to improve the efficiency. But we do have a good charge given to that committee by the board president already. So I think it's just noting that these are additional questions that ought to be discussed during that committee.
So who is on that committee?
It's myself, Board Member Tapia Romero is the chair, and Board Member Gonzalez. So the three of us are on that committee, along with the Finance Department with Renette and Jessica. And we're going to be answering key questions around legislatively what's required of us. So looking at the statutes and what's required, because I know Mr. Melendres is taking a deep dive on that as well. And we're going to still come back with recommendations in terms of what we're studying and what we're looking at. We'll come with recommendations on ways that we can, because remember, it's back to the issue of what's on consent, what's not, how do we do that? And then some of the other issues, are we actually looking at a lot of administrative things that we really shouldn't be looking at or don't really need to have, that really just don't give us a whole lot of information about finances. So, and I'm also taking to heart, Barbara, the conversation that was had at NMSBA. I thought that presentation that was given, I know Johanna was there as well. The presentation on finances was really helpful because she really did iterate for me the things that I cannot, as a board member, been on here for 6 years, I still am not comfortable with. But it was really around things, especially around forecasting. It's really around trends and looking at those ways. And also, how do we present information to the board that's transparent enough for us to also make sense of where things are? Because right now, the way that we look at them in a PDF form sometimes is not easy. It's not easy to, I'm not sure what we're discerning from it other than here's a line item, here's where expenditure was. I think we need to ask the deeper questions. And that's what this 3-member committee is going to do, is an opportunity for us to just take a look at that and really just sort of tackle the the issue of what should we be doing on finance. We'll be getting coaching as we're doing that as well, so that we're making sure that we're staying true to our obligation and our responsibility. I think because we have a huge responsibility around finances. But I think it's really complex in terms of what we've been putting before us now and how we look at it. I'm not sure that it's really helping us a whole lot sometimes.
So I think that kind of subcommittee is completely reasonable because it's putting together a
Yep.
proposal, and it'll help us synthesize through what we need to discuss. So, and I think the subcommittees on policy have been really useful
Mhm.
because it sort of sifts through for all of us. I think the month by month work of the finance committee is in a different realm. And so I think that the thought about what the finance committee should look like is very different for that ongoing monthly committee than it is for these committees that are
Sure.
taking on
You're
specific tasks.
And you're absolutely correct. That's exactly what this is. This is just an ad hoc kind of work group for us to roll up our shirt sleeves, kind of look at it and make some recommendations to the board based on just how we've been operating right now around finance. So ways that we can improve the way that we're looking at finances and the work of the board. So I think it's okay. It's not replacing the finance committee at all. This is not replacing. This is simply a work group. And I think as Board Member Gonzalez has mentioned in this particular policy, it's just a placeholder. It's a thought. I think we're hearing voices about that thought's not so great, but we can, like Board Member Gonzalez says, we'll noodle on that one and we'll wrestle with it as part of the committee.
And just by the by, I did send in my questions for the finance committee, and one of them was to follow up on Audrey Jaramillo's
Mhm.
recommendation for how to look at cash disbursements
Mhm.
so that it makes more sense.
Okay.
So that's just
I think
a
Crystal
little
Lounge
flag.
has a.
Member Tapia Romero.
And then I do.
Okay, thank you. And I'm trying to be mindful too, to make sure my questions are technical versus tactical and following, our process. So the question I had on page 2 is it looks like it's changed on the amount to 500,000 versus 250,000 on approval for expenditure. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. We were looking at this amount and just thinking about inflation, looking at other districts and the trends, and then also bringing to you, like you said, amounts that you really need to look at, and maybe not look at like consumables, like fuel and janitorial and paper, stuff like that, that are under this, and then just look at the more larger purchases for the district. So
I
that,
agree. And personally, I like that because there's some things that we can't change. This is how it is. And, these are expenses that we have to have as a district. My second question is, I didn't know if there had to be some type of language or if it's just wrapped up in the budget verbiage that we have there. When we have extra funding, like the ESSER funding, the way that has to be allocated or spent, or if that's just.
Board Member Tapia, we did talking about grants in here, that if it's over a certain amount, it would come to the board for approval. And that would be like ESSER funding.
You have it as new grants over 100,000,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
Okay.
Got it. Those are all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Jackson.
Well, being last, everybody asked my questions. Mine was the 500,000. Thank you, Board Member Tapia Romero. So I think just a couple things popped into my head as we were talking specifically around the community input section. If that is something that is in that big old book right there, one thing that I was thinking of, and we as a board can discuss this, is if that is maybe something that we add into the community engagement sessions, that if it is kind of a requirement, then maybe we build into those sessions that one of the sessions is purely on budget. And that's where we gather feedback, and you guys would have to tell us when that best time would be. I don't know if it'd be January, February, whatever, but that's just a thought, is that if that is really something that is important, then I think we could work our way into getting community, like, and meaty community input, not just replying to a survey. So that was one thought I had. The other, I just think the other thing is that I just want to ditto what Board Member Mueller-Aragon said around making sure that we're supporting students based on their needs. And, you know, again, because different students at different schools are going to have different needs, and to make sure that no matter where you end up, you know, wherever you happen to be, wherever you happen to live, and that's the school you happen to go to, that your needs are being met. So I will echo what she said. And oh, and then the third thing that I really like, and I appreciate you putting in, is a very specific statement about it being that the board is approving funding and not the vendor. And that's because I had that question earlier, a couple months ago. And so I appreciate that it's in there, because I think what that does is that really brings transparency again to the public. What is it that the board is doing, and what is it that the administration is deciding? And so I think that's a very good addition to the policy. And I like the statement around budgeting approach. And not only that, but again, putting it in writing and saying this is what we are going to do, just again, like solidifies. I've noticed, like, if I tell somebody that I'm going to do something, it's kind of easy for me, like, oh, well, you just forgot. But if I write it to them and say, I promise that I will do this on a certain time, then it's more hefty and weighted. So I appreciate that it's in there, and I think it's a good policy, and I appreciate your work on it.
I just have one other question that I forgot about. So when it comes to the final budget, not the draft budget, but the final budget, it is totally not amendable. And is that like written down somewhere where it's not amendable?
Madam Chair, Member Mueller-Aragon, it's a board policy. If the board decides they would like to revisit and review, it can be amended, with the exception, of course, of things that are statutorily required, but anything that applies to the board's hands-on activity for the budget is amendable.
Okay, because here it said you can make changes to the draft budget, but it didn't mention anything about the final.
About the budget itself, not the policy.
No.
correct? You're talking about the
Oh,
budget.
the actual budget
Just
itself?
on the policy here, we're under budget development, the very last on the first page says the board may vote to make changes to the draft budget, but it doesn't mention anything about the final budget being amendable. So I was just wondering if that is something that
Oh.
should be in there, shouldn't be in there. I don't know if
Well,
it matters.
So there's the section on budget development in terms of how the budget is developed. Once it's approved, then we get to the next section on budget management. So the second paragraph there, once the budget is approved, any request for modification of a budgetary line item will be approved by appropriate, that section talks about what happens. And that the board must approve the reallocation of funds. So it's in
And I
it's
get that
in the
part.
next part.
I get that part, because that's something that I know that we do. Once it's already approved, I'm just talking about before that. Just in the budget development, because you come up with the draft budget, but then you come up with the final budget, right?
Correct. And we bring
Oh,
it to the board for
yeah.
approval.
Yep.
Mhm.
Here, Board Member Mueller-Aragon and members of the board, there's a couple of things you said that I just like. I guess I'm gonna push on it a little bit. Final draft of the budget comes to you really at the end of a very long process. You should not be making changes to the budget at that point. Oftentimes, and you've run into this with us before, we've been like, we have to turn it in. Statutorily, we have to turn it in, and we've had multiple iterations of this budget. We've run it past you for a number of times. I mean, I don't know that you can write it in your it's your policy. I can't tell you to write your policy, but I would strongly recommend you not be making adaptations or amendments to the final budget, because that is really almost impossible logistically to meet both the statutory obligations and just the physical limitations of a budget department and an administration. I would also say, as far as, I think it's a great question. I think it's something you probably want to define in your policy and I just would hate to see that. You know, I don't know how to limit you, but I think you are limited by reality, so there's that. The other thing is, in this community input on the budget, I would ask that you sort of define what you think that is. I know I heard substantive, and that's good, but we need to remember, we go out and we show every school budget to every school community, and they all give input to the school site, and the school site gets to make some adjustments based on what they're hearing. When we put the entire budget in front of the community, they often have great ideas, real interesting thoughts on how to spend the money. I can spend somebody else's money really well, but that they don't realize, and we can't often explain, is one, how much of the operational budget is tied up in salary and how limited we are. I mean, we gave you the chart a few months ago of the $100 million in new money, and then we really had to make $5 million that we could do anything with, because the rest it had already been spent by the time it got to us, right? So that's a limiting factor that's hard to explain. And again, this sort of goes down to the ERS. My thought on the ERS money is what they're hoping to do is flex out some more discretionary money at the school site. So sites can make decisions, and you talk about equitable decisions. They're making sites at the local level instead of us coming up on top and saying, well, you're going to spend it on this. And that's where the change will occur. When you talk about community input, I think you need to define what you mean by that, because we do take community input and we do put the budget out. But you're right, many times it is just a survey. But that has a place in that level of work that I'd ask that you consider as you develop this policy.
And I guess I would add is that it would make sense that if that is their best opportunity as a community member to give input, then perhaps what we need to be better at is just communicating to parents and to the community, here's your shot, here's the best time for you to go and to give input. So that it's not just the roll-up, because I agree with you, Superintendent. The roll-up is very confusing because it's huge and it lacks that connection to their school and to their community. So perhaps what we just need to be better at is just making sure that we're honest, or that we're transparent with the community, or saying, hey, this is your shot. This is your best opportunity to really give feedback. And so maybe it's really also supporting our schools and that school community in a way so that they can be really good at that too, because I think that's also the hardest part, is like, how do they get community input and how do they manage that community input when it comes at them?
I think there's an explanation part to it too. I think the budget, to your point, is so massive and really nobody understands how it's put together. So I do think that there is definitely some benefit to just an explanation, and maybe an explanation every year. This is how the budget was built, but us going to them, right? You can tune in all you want to the board meetings, but us going out to them and explaining how it occurred.
I think that's fair.
So with that in mind, on page 1, as part of the budget development process, the superintendent and designees first sentence, there's a list that kind of lists out some of the ways that we might gather community feedback, such as in-person or virtual hearings, online surveys. I would add a comma at the school site or at school sites or something like that. And then in a user-friendly format or something, or easy to understand format. So something like that on that. Accessible. But to not mean just like ADA accessible, but like, I know what you mean, but. Okay. So my comments were, also on page 1 in the list of what's going to be included in the budget updates, I was hoping we can add either in bullet 1, 2, 3, 4 or in bullet 6, projections and forecasts, because I think that's implied when we're talking about revenues and costs. But to be clear that and you're already doing this, but to the best of our ability, we're projecting what anticipated revenue is, and we're projecting what anticipated costs are. We say significant issues related to changes, and that also just feels a little broad. And then similarly, on page 3 in the financial reporting, it would be helpful to see projections or forecasts in here as well. And so I'm not sure which section it belongs in, but as we get reports, whenever we know something about projections, I think having that in that column is included, or it would help. Similarly, in the financial reports section, it would be helpful to have language around alignment to goals and strategic plan. And again, you're already beginning to do this in the PowerPoint presentations when you show us how the budget was allocated by different goals. And so I think just indicating that you're going to continue to do that. And as we get better and tighter with that, I think that's going to help. And then the last thing for me that was in the model policy, which oh no, never mind. It's here, per pupil expenditures, right there, in front of my face, second bullet in the second section. Perfect. Okay. Any other comments, questions, suggestions on the not yet a policy, but a drafty draft, first draft of what will become a policy?
Is that a legal term? Drafty draft for.
Art nodded, it's a legal term. All right, we will move on. Thank you to our two presenters. We will move on to agenda item 4.2, which is board norms, guardrails, and governance manual. So this is a pretty chunky piece of the agenda, and so we're going to take it in chunks. We are going to start with the guardrails. And so we did have a board work session last week on September 13th, and the notes have been provided. So they are printed out in front of us on the dais. It's the post-workshop coaching memo, and there's a little red tab which will point you to those draft guardrails. And so in terms of our order for today, we're going to first go through the guardrails because we want to continue to edit and refine those and get them better, so that we can vote on them during the next policy committee meeting, which is October 2nd. So we're going to actually review them and revise them in this meeting so that they can come before you again when you receive your packet for the policy committee meeting that is October 2nd. Ideally, we vote on October 2nd, and those become our guardrails. Those then get placed into the governance manual, replacing the code of ethics, which is currently there. And so for this meeting, after we review the guardrails, we'll next go to reviewing the code of ethics. We'll talk about that as it relates to the conflict of interest. And then we will also just talk about the governance manual overall. The goal, again, is to also vote on the governance manual. So we'll be voting on the guardrails, we'll be voting on the governance manual as a whole, and then subsequently, as we need to make updates to the policies, we'll make sure that those are voted on as legally required as well. And part of that's going to come in agenda item the next agenda item 4.3, the policy review, where we'll go over that process as well. So right now, I would encourage you to take a minute to read through those draft policies that are on the little red tab, and I'm also going to project them on the screen. So you have them in front of you in hard copy. They're on the screen without all of the other notes from the meeting, but still the questions that were proposed by our coach, which you can see in front of you in your notes, are also on the screen here. So I'm going to, again, give a couple of minutes, review your hard copy, make your notes, and then we're going to go through one by one and live edit them. As you're reviewing, I just want to call out in the hard paper copy that you have, 1 and 2, for the purpose of this discussion, I combined them in what you see in front of you as number 1. So that's why there's 1 less. Any questions about that? The process, questions about process? Okay, then we're taking just 2 minutes, 2, 3 or so minutes to review the hard copy of the brain. Oh, And Crystal has these, yes? Yes, okay, good, great, yes. So we're reviewing the draft guardrails. Are we ready? The reverse of that, is anyone not ready? Okay. Also, I forgot to mention at our seats, and Crystal, we received this in email as well, is the evaluating governing policies document. And so we are going to use this as our framework for how we evaluate these governance policies. And so on page 4, they're not numbered, but if you turn to the 4th page, it's section 3, guidance on common high priority governing policies. About midway through the page, there's boards guardrails for the board. These are specific operational actions or class of actions the board places on itself and or its members to support behaviors that keep the board's focus on board work, aligned with the vision and goals and grounded in community values. So there are 4 guiding questions that will guide us through this process. The first one, what roadblocks currently exist that prevent the board from focusing on student outcomes? And so for the purpose of the minutes, transparency, and just public awareness, this is the item that we discussed in the September 13th work session. So the board worked through a conversation around what gets in the way of us focusing on student outcomes and what of our own behaviors that we can control gets in the way of allowing the board to focus on student outcomes. So we had a very generative conversation on that first question. Certainly, we can continue to bring up additional roadblocks during this meeting as well. So thinking about that as one of the guiding questions. The second, what kind of limitations can be put in place to set expectations of board behavior that is aligned with the community's values? So again, limitations that can be put in place to set expectations for our behavior. The third, what kind of limitations will help board members stay in their lane and not micromanage the school system? So thinking about that as how that also informs our guardrails. And the fourth are guardrails for the board being considered as a means to promote teamwork and trust versus policing or controlling individuals. So as we move through these, those are sort of the, that's our literal guidance on evaluating our governance policies. So we are going to start with the first and second, which are individual board members shall not make assumptions about each other's intentions or shall not assume ill intent of each other. Some of the feedback that we received is for us to clarify how will we know if this is being honored, and maybe change make to act on, because everyone will make assumptions. So I'm opening up the floor to edits, feedback, suggestions, and as much as possible, not wordsmithing and copy editing and commas. Any feedback on this first one? Member Jackson.
Sorry, I was trying to find my microphone. Well, I think this first one, I mean, this one gets to the heart of the conversation that we had on September 13th, and it definitely discusses the trust, which is in that fourth bullet about our guardrails being considered as a means to promote teamwork and trust. And I think that this, of all of them that are presented right now, is the one that speaks the most to that. I think I would agree. I just through reading through this coaching, I do like the act on recommendation. But I think this is one that kind of gets to the trust issue.
Wonderful. Other feedback or suggestions? Member Tapia Romero, I can't see if you're raising your hand because you're a small box now, but I'll go ahead and turn to you for any feedback on this first one.
No, I don't have any. Thank you, though.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, the only thing I would ask is, how would you know someone was acting on their assumptions? How do you truly know that? Sometimes it's a perception sometimes, but how are we going to really know that that one of us might be acting upon our assumptions? Because we all make them. So
what do you think?
I mean, what do you, I really don't know. I honestly don't know how, because we all said we're all going to make assumptions, because we just make assumptions about people almost the minute we meet somebody. So how do you get trained to not act on the assumptions that you know you made?
Can I jump in there, Board Member Gonzalez?
Yes, please.
Here's what it reminds me of, like with that particular question. And I think those of us who've been teachers, like, and when we've done observations in classrooms and we're having to make an unbiased and make sure that we're objective. So I would assume that we would, want to make sure that it's factual, that there's, I guess, activities or actions that can back up the belief, not just based on a feeling or a thought. And same thing with our observations. And when we've done like portfolio samples in classrooms, we want to make sure that we're unbiased and we can actually support it by an activity that a student did, to show that they're capable of mastering a particular subject or an item. So that's how I'm relaying it, for us, for ourselves, is just making sure we're unbiased and we remain objective.
Is there a way that you think we might add some of that language around objectivity and bias to the guardrail? And that's an open question to everyone.
we also have all of us have our biases that I think we learn to recognize, but we still live with them and have them. This is just a hard one. Like, I really believe this is really important. I think it's a hard one for us to be able to be accountable to each other. I think this is important. It's like, how are you going to be accountable, and how are you going to know that this is happening? I understand the factual, what Member Tapia Romero was saying.
I think Member Jackson has a suggestion.
Okay.
So I might have a suggestion. Well, you just said that. So in the Code of Ethics as it stands right now, number 6, it says accept responsibility and accountability for one's own actions and behaviors. That's in our current Code of Ethics. So I almost wonder if those two can be combined in some way, which then would make individual board members shall not act on assumption about each other's intentions and will accept responsibility for their own actions and behaviors. I wonder if that, Board Member Tapia Romero, does that kind of highlight maybe what you were saying?
Yes, you just said it a whole lot better.
Only because I found it in the document.
There you go. Yes.
Thank you. The second proposed guardrail was board members shall not assume ill intent of each other. I added it onto this one. Do we want to maintain it somehow? Individual board members shall not act on assumptions about each other's intentions or assume ill intent of each other, and will accept responsibility for one's own actions and behaviors, or let it go, or
I think
something
it's
else?
Covered in the first one.
Mhm.
I think
It's repetitive.
Okay, we're gonna let that go. Okay. Any other feedback on guardrail number 1? For now, and then it'll come back for additional discussion and vote.
No, I like the addition that Board Member Jackson added in there. I think it's fine.
Great. Moving on to number 2. Board members will not spend board time on issues not related to student outcomes. We have 2 pieces of coaching here related to making it sort of measurable with the 50% of their time monitoring student outcomes, changing related to student outcomes to board work, and not appearing to perform the job of the superintendent. So Member Peterson, would you like to start us off with proposed edits?
How about just phrasing it as will not spend less than 50% of time on issues not related to student outcomes and required board work? Or there might be another word other than required, but things that we are statutorily responsible for.
I think if you just state the 50% on student outcomes, that, we will not spend less than 50%. I mean, it assumes that the other 50% is just our board work. There's other things that we have to do. Yeah. Yeah.
Slimmed down
Mhm.
quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So is it, if I cut that, board members will not spend less than 50% of board time on issues not related to board work? No, that's all right.
No, I was thinking less than 50% of board time on student outcomes. I don't know. I'm lost. Okay.
Okay, board members will not spend less than 50% of board time on issues
Not really.
not related. I'm trying to think of, it's a double negative. So where are we with the double negative?
So if this might help, so in the current document, where I just inserted just SOFG standard language, it says the board members will not invest less than 50% of its time each month into monitoring student outcome goals. So that kind of gets to the student outcome goals aspect of it. But I think what this one was actually trying to address was spending our time doing board work. And I think this was more getting to an efficiency.
Yeah, and her second
Discussion.
comment about appearing to perform the job of the superintendent.
Yeah.
Member Montoya Cordova, I think you were helping us clarify too.
Mhm.
So board members will not spend less than 50% of board time on issues.
And now I'm just struggling with it
With
because
the double knots.
yeah, and I think the 50% time, I mean, I think it's just that board members will not spend board time on issues not related to student outcomes or because I was thinking, we're not going to spend any of our time. We're going to have to spend some of our time outside of student outcomes because there are things that are required. But I hear you, what's the most important part? And we're not going to be like trying to do the superintendent's job. Something like that.
Do we want to keep Member Jackson's clarification on each month? 50% of its time each month or go back to 50% of its time, period, not
I think
period,
it's just
but
50% of our time because there might be,
like this,
yeah.
student outcomes, right?
Just student outcomes.
Student outcomes. No,
I mean, I thought what you said in the second, where board members will not spend less than 50% of their time monitoring. I think that's what Madam President had said about student outcome goals. And then you're not using the word board more than necessary.
board members will not spend less than 50% of its time, their time, monitoring student outcomes and statutorily required, no. Nope.
Because do we want to just be, are we concentrating right now? And this is just a question we need to ask about the time we're monitoring the goals. Or are we just talking about student outcomes in general and not just monitoring?
Well, I think what Ashley's comment was change student outcomes to board work to make sure that we're not doing superintendent work. So I think what her edit would have it read is board members will not spend less than 50% of its time on board work. And we could make it statutorily required, but
Yeah, well, then you're saying board members will not spend their time on issues not related to board work? Or do you want to? Because that's what we're supposed to be doing.
I think it helps to make it a little bit more specific. I mean, the thing about this is that we can creatively say almost anything we do is related to board work, because when we went back to the days of doing board recognitions, we could say that that has to do with outcomes because it has to do with the morale of staff. And so there are benefits to doing that. There are reasons to not do it, but that can be a fairly broad, I was a teacher, I can make almost anything worth doing fit into one of the standards. And do it honestly and legitimately. I mean, I have a good reason for it.
But I think the purpose, the purpose of this guardrail is for us to stick to the fidelity of SOFG. And so we are setting an intention and a guardrail that we're not going to spend less of our time, because board meetings prior to this, we really weren't doing that. So I think it's the guardrail is really around the commitment to changing our agendas to include that monitoring piece, that we're monitoring student outcomes.
I know you're trying to type and change things as we're saying, but I have another suggestion.
Yep.
Okay, board members will not spend less than 50% of board time on issues not related to board work by delegating authority for the administration of the schools to the superintendent, which pulls in number 9 from our current code of ethics.
By delegating authority.
For the administration of the schools to the superintendent.
So board members will not spend less than 50% of board authorized public meetings monitoring goals, student outcomes, and on issues not related.
I think less than 50% of board authorized public meetings monitoring goals, student outcomes, and statutorily required board work by delegating authority for the administration to this of the schools to the superintendent. So I think that maybe brings in the SOFG 50% that we're all trying to get those points for, but also addresses what this is really meant to be is we need to focus on board work and the superintendent needs to do everything else.
Yes.
Maybe.
I had 3 dots from Ashley and they went away. So I'm assuming that means she agrees with you. So we have board members will not spend less than 50% of board authorized public meetings monitoring goals, student outcomes, and maybe addressing something like that. Statutorily required board work by delegating authority for the administration of the schools to the superintendent. And we can wordsmith more later, but is this grabbing the concepts?
So Ashley is typing, she typed to me and she said that SOFG has a specific definition of board work. So we could just say that it won't spend less than 50% of board authorized public meetings monitoring goals and conducting board work, I guess. I don't know. I mean, I'm having a hard time I think let's put something out there. It's drafty draft. And then we can
Draft.
and our new word of the night, our drafty draft.
Okay, so drafty draft, board members will not spend less than 50% of board authorized public meetings monitoring goals, monitoring goals and student outcomes, comma, and conducting, we might keep or not keep statutorily required board work as defined by SOFG by delegating authority for the administration of the schools to the superintendent.
That's good.
It's very clunky. We may add some commas and hyphens, but we have the concept. Okay.
And our high-powered English person isn't here, so.
Moving to draft number 3. The board shall not make major decisions without community voice, including students, family, and staff. And her coaching was, how will you develop a shared definition of major decisions? So member Tapamero, just so I'm making sure I'm getting you in this one. Did you have feedback or edits on 3?
No, board member Gonzalez.
Great, thank you. The floor is open then for other edits, including how we'll develop a shared definition of major decisions.
Just reflecting back on the board policy that we just discussed, there were bullet points in there as to what some of the major decisions that we as a board we're going to have to make. So I wonder if major decisions is defined.
I wonder if that's also defined. What are the defined pieces of board work right under SOFG? So
like, are they defined in our policy? You know, because
so is
shall
it
not
like
make major.
we shall not make major decisions that are not in alignment with SOFG? I mean, I guess which I don't know. Because I'm right. What's a major decision?
Well, I think what I'm saying is we don't have to define major decisions in the guardrail itself, because in other policies, the major decisions are defined. In other policies, the major decisions are defined. For example, the board policy that we just read says when it's over 500,000, that's a major decision and it comes to the board. So maybe major decision, the board shall not make major decisions as defined by policy without community voice, including students, family, and staff, or something like that.
I think that applies certainly to the budget we just read, but I'm trying to think about what are other major decisions like superintendent appointment, hiring. And I don't know that's in the superintendent hiring policy,
But it's in statute, so maybe,
that we have to seek public input.
no, but it's a major decision.
Right,
Maybe
so
so major
that's-
decision is defined as statutory requirements.
You know, I can't spell or say statutorily.
But
I don't know, I'm just throwing, just,
can we say something like the board shall not exclude community voice and put students, family, and staff when making important decisions? And then we're not saying major decisions, but that we're not going to exclude their voice.
Oh, that's a good one. I like that too.
So the board shall not exclude community voice and list the students, family, and staff when making important decisions.
But we still have important decisions then, or which isn't then defined.
We gotta define. Or do we, I mean, or do we have to define, do we have to have that defined?
Well, we don't
How
have to
will
do
we develop?
anything, but that's.
I mean, do we
then
have
from our
to
culture
define?
making it better.
So I think policy is a major decision that we need to make with the community. I mean, examples of our handbook and such, those are major decisions. So I would put something more specific, including
Not limited to, maybe?
when making major decisions such as budget, the hiring of a superintendent, the setting of goals and guardrails, and
Well,
policy and policy.
let me, getting some coaching. So for this one, the guardrail doesn't have to define it, but you should have an agreement on what that means. Generally, it means issues of owner support. So, I guess the way that it's written in terms of like, the board shall not exclude community voice, including students, families, staff, when making major decisions or important decisions. I mean, I really personally like Board Member Jackson's, as stated, in policy, because but I agree. Yeah, never mind. You're right, because we don't have it stated in all our policy. That's true. Okay.
For our first draft, the board shall not exclude community voice, including students, family, and staff, when making major or important decisions such as budget, superintendent hiring, setting of goals and guardrails, student handbook, issues of, well, obviously no one knows what owner support means, but and policy, something like that.
We have the idea there, so.
Something like that for now. We're good?
That looks good.
Okay. Number four, board members shall not act in isolation from the board. Another way to phrase this, no board member shall represent or appear to represent the voice of the full board on matters that the board has not publicly adopted through their speech or actions. And there is something already in our code of
Mhm.
ethics,
Mhm.
conduct.
code of
I like
ethics.
the
I like the
coach's
way.
recommendation,
I like that recommendation too. I think it's.
clear.
Hey.
Right, no board member shall represent or appear to represent the voice of the full board. I'm sorry, captioning, I talked too fast. On matters that the board has not publicly adopted through their speech or actions.
Mhm.
It's good.
We
for
can
our
take some
first
words out of there.
draft.
Yeah, we can take some words out of there.
Something saying being respectful of staff time and resources. Maybe we could also integrate this into the guardrail about wasting time, which I believe is number 1, right? No, sorry,
It's
number 2.
But I think we turned number 2 into more of a delegation guardrail instead of a efficiency wasting time guardrail is how I read it.
Uh-huh.
Like a governance piece, yeah.
Okay, so
So I think, yeah, I think it'd be good to have an efficiency guardrail.
board members will not waste staff time and resources.
Hello, how long are we going now? Yeah.
Yeah, the board,
Be a funny policy.
the board shall not be disrespectful of staff time.
And resources.
Be disrespectful
Or
of
shall not
staff
be
time
disrespectful.
and resources. I like that.
Mhm.
How will you know whether or not it's being honored?
The
Well, we're gonna
superintendent will
supposed
tell
to-
us.
But we're supposed to track it, right? Isn't part of SOFG monitoring how much time our meetings like actually?
Oh, and also the time investment from staff in answering our questions and things like that. So so there is a way for us to evaluate ourselves against that. I think it would probably, I mean, I would say that the board president probably plays a role here in terms of like knowing whether it's being honored or not, because the board president may be the one that's actually going to hear a complaint.
From the staff.
Which is reasonable.
Yeah.
It's the
Mhm.
right chain of command.
Yeah.
to-
And then it's up to the board president to liaison with the board members saying, oh, you know, because I do a lot of problem solving with Johanna.
I think that they are different and they need to be stated differently,
Mhm.
but I think that the guardrail of 50% of our time does also give us some guidelines for how we're using staff time.
Mhm.
In all of these, I mean, there's not really an enforcement power for any of these. It's really setting a code of conduct that we internalize and follow.
Mhm.
There's no policeman that's going to come and enforce it. So I think that it's really just being clear about what the intent is.
Well, I think stating it as a guardrail puts
Mhm.
it on us for sure, because then it sets that expectation. And we're also responsible for policing ourselves.
Great. I added in a sentence as well, the board has established a process for tracking the cost of staff time at least annually, which came from our coach. So we can also, we can edit that as well.
Well, it's also reflected later on in the governance manual when it talks about like the board meeting procedures, the board meeting materials, where we've kind of set out the expectation of how we're going to be, you know, using time. So I think it's established in the manual.
Great, that is a great segue to the manual.
Oh, good. Can I go?
And so let's go ahead and take a quick bio break. And we'll come back in 5 to 7 minutes to move on to the next agenda item. Many papers.
Okay, I'm gonna start.
We had some high points.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are we waiting on? Oh, there he is.
Are we live? We're ready to go?
We are live and ready to go.
Fantastic. Thank you. We are ready to reconvene from our break. Prior to the break, I stated that we were moving on to the next agenda item, but that was just wishful thinking. We're actually still on agenda item 4.2. I said we were chunking it out. So we finished the first chunk, which was the guardrails. We're moving now on to the second chunk, which is the code of ethics. During this part of the agenda, we're also going to share screen and make some edits as we're moving. So the edits this time are going to be to the board governance manual. As a reminder, we will be voting again on the board governance manual as a whole. It is full of some new language, old language, as well as policy language, and there's color coding in there. The red type is specific policies. And so we're going to be going through tonight, specifically the code of ethics, which is on page 7. And the code of conduct, which is on page 8. Any other edits that members have to the board governance manual overall can still be emailed back to the staff for consideration as edits to be brought before us in the October 2nd meeting. So those will come again with the packet that comes before the October 2nd meeting. But we do want to make sure we're spending our time on the juiciest stuff. And so if everyone can turn now to page 7 of the board governance manual, we have the code of ethics or governing values. On this one, the key point is that what is currently listed as the code of ethics is actually our guardrails. So when this governance manual is approved, we're going to actually cut out the red text that is here. Our governing values will be our guardrails that we just discussed. And so for now, what I'm going to ask everyone to do is to look through that governing values code of ethics section on page 7 and 8. Read through those, keeping in mind, we're going to cut this unless there is something in here that you think is important enough to maintain in the code of conduct, which is a different section that starts on page 8. So you're reviewing pages 7 of 8, that code of 7 and 8, that code of ethics, knowing that we're going to cut it, replace it with guardrails, and take a minute to highlight anything that you think is important and worth keeping and moving into the code of conduct. Does anyone need more time? Okay, so we have the governing values as currently stated in policy on the screen. This is going to go away and be replaced with guardrails. Is there anything in this list that's 1 through 12 that we need to keep and move into code of conduct that's on page 8?
I absolutely want number 1. That was something that when I first got on the board, we never ever talked about making education and the well-being of students, just making decisions all based on what's best for them. I think that's why we're here. And that's what we're trying to do with student outcome focused governance is we're trying to focus everything that we're doing and all decisions we're making on their getting the best education possible. So other than that, I think a lot of that is somewhere else.
Yeah, a lot of it is already in administrative code, in statute, in our guardrails, in our new guardrails, in the code of conduct already that's on the next page. So we can take this first one, make the education of well-being of students the basis for decision-making and keep that. Is there anything else that jumped out at people as being important to keep?
I think it's all included.
Yay, then I think we're ready to move on to the next chunk of agenda item 4.2, which is the code of conduct, which is later on in the page. And on this one, we're also going to use the evaluating governing policies framework that we have from the Council of Great City Schools. So as we did for the guardrails, there is a section in this document that's the hard copy that we have at our seats, evaluating governing policies. 1, 2, 4. On page 5, the bottom of page 5 are the guiding questions for evaluating board member conflict of interest. They go on to the next page. So as we review this code of conduct / conflict of interest language, does the policy address the legal threshold required by the state as a bare minimum? Does it address real and perceived conflicts of interest? Does it state the presence of community confidence and trust as the primary justification for the policy? Does the policy restrict individual board members from voting or deliberating on issues related to individuals who have made campaign contributions? Does the policy restrict individual board members from voting or deliberating on issues related to family members who meet a mutually identified threshold? I can't pronounce that. Consanguinity, close?
Got it.
Okay, I'm going with it. Do consequences exist for the violation of this or any other policy? So again, do folks want a minute to read through the member code of conduct?
Sure. And while they're doing that, so you guys are aware, when I inserted this policy in, it looks like I doubled up. So number 3 and number 4 are restatements of number 1 and number 2. So you can just delete number 3 and number 4.
Okay, so we're going to take a minute to read this page 8, code of conduct, and then we're going to have a conversation around, does this meet the framework of guiding questions from the Council of Great City Schools? And if the answer to any of those questions is no, we're going to go ahead and make some proposed edits here, acknowledging that this is maybe not drafty draft, but it's a draft. It'll come back to us for additional feedback. As with other policies, there's opportunity for public impact. We'll vote on it on October 2nd is the goal, and then it'll go to full board for consent as well. Are we ready to start the discussion? Yeah, I'm ready.
I'm ready.
All right, we'll go. So keeping in mind those questions that are on the unnumbered pages. Board member conflict of interest policy. Now that you've re-reviewed the conflict of interests and those questions, if your answer to any of those questions is no, if you can highlight that and propose changes or edits to this proposed document. So maybe I'll just go down the line. President Montoya Cordova, did you have any suggestions, reactions, or feedback?
I think just on number 7, I think board members should recuse themselves from matters involving individuals or organizations when there's a potential for conflict of interest or a perceived conflict of interest. But to just say to who made campaign contributions to them or who appointed them, again, I guess I'm just, how is this? For me, again, it goes back to that level of trust on the individual, knowing that there's a real, I mean, who's deciding what's a conflict of interest here?
We are.
I know, but how? So just by looking at the list of campaign contributions?
That's one way. I mean, it is for us to decide. So it can be setting a threshold. It can be looking at the list. It could be.
So maybe I just need clarification on where's an area of concern for the board.
You mean?
Yeah, where's an area, what's the area of concern on a campaign contribution? I want an example of one, an organization who made a campaign contribution to them. I want an example of one so that I can understand what the concern is.
Because then that would restrict, wouldn't it, Madam Chair? Does a policy restrict individual board members from voting or deliberating on issues related? I mean, it would keep you from voting. I mean, I'm just thinking about the union contract, and if they gave money to a campaign contributions, that would keep them from voting on the CBA. That would keep them from that, and that's right, wouldn't it then?
Well, it's not
Possibly.
I just want to be clear, it's not the union that gives a campaign contribution.
And how are we going to know that from that,
So
those
if-
words?
So that's what I'm trying to understand is just what's the, if it's not coming from the union itself, because the union doesn't write you a check. I'm going to use that as an example because I think that's where everybody's getting hung up on.
Yeah.
So whether it's the educators union or it's the educational assistance union, they're all belonging to they all have different ones. So they all have a PAC that they are part of, that they organize themselves outside of that for their legislative policies and the other things that they're doing. So union work is separate from their legislative policy and their other work. So is that considered a conflict of interest by this board?
So I think where I'm focusing in on this is the campaign contribution. And you asked the question, like, where are campaign contributions becoming an issue? There are people that are looking at campaign contributions on all sides. And it is becoming an issue where people are going back through and are looking at where campaign contributions came from, right? And so I think in an effort to bring some specificity to this line, to like remove some ambiguity as to what campaign, where does a campaign contribution become potentially a conflict of interest? I think that's where it's important maybe to put in a dollar amount, to add in some, like, a figure, because it then creates the specificity that you're asking for, but it's not union campaign contributions or NAIOP contributions, campaign contributions recently have become an issue. And so if we are going to address that and are going to be transparent to the public, I think so that we are addressing number 1, 2, 3, 4, does the policy restrict individual board members from voting on issues related to individuals who have made campaign contributions? Then yes, it does. But then to bring in the specificity, we could, as a suggestion, say recuse themselves from matters involving individuals or organizations who made campaign contributions over $1,000, whether individual or aggregate amounts, to, not to them or who appointed them, but something like that. That brings in the specificity because campaign contributions is an issue. For every single one of us sitting up here.
So do we take out this language? And if board members,
Yeah, that was confusing.
and I think the other question is on the bottom of page, the second question, does the policy address real and perceived conflicts of interest? So we have conflict or perceived conflict.
Well, if I could just jump in, because I think even a good comparison would be, say, like if particular charter schools even made a donation to any particular candidate, and then they're bringing up something on the agenda to maybe approve an expansion or approve, something that they need. And if this charter school made a donation, I would think you would be expected to recuse yourself. I think that's even a good comparison. I know this is a tricky one, and I know this is a heavy, heavy topic for a lot of us, but for me, just last week, I was asked about a contribution that I received, from people that were tied to an organization. And I was like, I'm not even tied to this organization. And having to explain that, but, and I think this is where it comes to us being completely transparent with everyone.
Well, I think transparency is definitely the key. And I mean, by New Mexico state statute, we've got a sunshine portal. Anyone can look at any of our campaigns and see who gave us money and who didn't. So I'm curious, and this may be a legal question, is there anything in state statute that limits contributions to school board campaigns? And is there any power of enforcement on the part of the board? If there's not in state statute, is there anything that would give the board enforcement power over making someone recuse themselves? I mean, I'm just thinking from a practical point of view, because how it gets interpreted could easily be a majority of the board basically refusing to give voice to a minority on the board. And I think that's something that the board has always, traditionally tried to avoid. So for instance, to the issue of voting on the contract of a negotiated agreement with one of the bargaining units, it could be that we put it in, and by a vote of 4-3, 4 decide that you should have no voice on that vote, and we will exclude you from the vote if that is not done voluntarily. Or that it could go the other way if the majority of the board decides that 3 people received contributions from NAOP and are making decisions about capital investment by the board, that minority of 3 should not vote. And I think it gets very murky over who we try to silence and who we try to give voice to, because any one of us could end up in a minority position at any point in time. And so it gets really tricky. And for that reason, I mean, I think that statutorily, I would love to see campaign limits. But am I right that there's nothing in statute?
Hello, Mr. Melendres.
Good evening. Chair, members of the committee, you are correct. There is nothing in state statute that limits the amount that an individual or PAC or organization can contribute to a candidate. You have raised a very interesting question, and I received this a week ago and I'm working on it. I want to share with you that I had an opportunity to visit with the county attorney, who said, that's interesting. This very same issue is before the county commission. And we have been through, they're a little bit, seem to say he's a little bit ahead of you, in that we've been through several iterations. And this is just an open-ended conversation by me, put up with me a minute. He said, we started with saying, if there is a $250,000 or more contribution, that should be disclosed.
Done.
Okay, board members, fess up.
If
Let's hear.
he then said, we faced questions about who's going to monitor that in terms of real enforcement other than the integrity of individuals. Joanna asked me a question and I responded by, in all of the RFPs that I'm aware of, requests for proposals, the proposer is asked to sign a disclosure of campaign contribution form. And that one is if an individual gave a board member or county commissioner, in my case, board member, more than $250, you should disclose to whom it was given and the amount. Mr. Martinez said he, having even spoken with the ethics attorney at the University of New Mexico, is in the process of evaluating this, and they're not quite ready to make a final decision. He said that his, and this is, I don't want to take words out of his mouth, but his preference is that the Secretary of State has her campaign contribution reporting portal, and that whether it's $100 or $10,000, it has to be reported, and there are some requirements under state reporting of campaign contributions. And he's like, well, instead of each one of us governmental entities trying to enforce an amount and tracking it, maybe we should be making full disclosure through the portal. And I have found that an interesting approach, but then I thought about a construction company who gave $10,000 to a candidate, and lo and behold, 6 months later, the construction approval of the award, the bid to a construction company, happens to be the same one, comes before the board. Well, the portal will reflect that campaign contribution. So then the question is, can the board member say, yes, I received $10,000, but that doesn't affect me at all. I'm going to vote on this contract, affirmatively or negatively. I received $5,000 from the Union PAC. it has nothing to do with my individual decision. I've looked at everything and I'm comfortable that I can vote my conscience and my best view of where we are. So I am still stuck, and I'm gonna beg a little more time, but I'm where I'm coming to is the difference, and this is with all due respect to the Council of Great City Schools and your coach, and no disrespect there, but it comes to me to will recuse or will disclose. And it seems to me whatever limit you set, if you were going to set a floor or a ceiling for the guardrail, sort of begs the question of, what is my good faith decision? So the final thing I will say is what is in statute is the right of citizens to file a recall of an individual board member who, you follow the statute, has either, I'm going to use simple words, but has not followed good behavior in exercising their duties as a board member. And so anyway, I don't know where to end up here, but it's a tough one. You've raised a very interesting question, and I think you, even more than in the past, you are all correct that there are many eyes looking at all candidates, where they get their money and what actions they take. And if that comports with good decision-making or is influenced by the contribution. So I'm struggling with will recuse themselves without at least a limit. A minimal amount is for your guardrail. I don't know how campaign, this is still in an interesting world of this. New Mexico State Legislature has tackled this and introduced, I'm going to give this to you to share, but they have two statutes which they have tried to codify in law for legislators and state employees. And it basically says you have to remember and act in good conscience. But if it is demonstrated that you have abused your public office, and I'll point you after you get that passed down to 1016(3)D. You should not accept anything of value or a promise that is conditioned upon or given in exchange for promised performance of an official act. So if someone says very specifically, I'll make a big contribution to you, but you know what I expect, that gets you to the point where and up above, full disclosure of real, or in C above, full disclosure of real or potential conflicts of interest shall be the guiding principle. So of determining appropriate conduct. So just without a minimum, I'm struggling with will recuse, because if I give you $1, then you will recuse from voting. And that seems to me out of bounds with just common sense, if you will. But
thank you for that. And I think, so we've inserted a placeholder dollar amount in here. And so I want to ask, how do people feel about 1,000? Do you want to make it 5? Do you want to make it 10? Do you want to make it $20? So that we can move ahead for now and allow Mr. Melendez more time to continue to research, and other folks as well, acknowledging that this is just discussion tonight. So that's what I want folks to think about. While I'm acknowledging that Member Tapia Romero has her hand raised, I will call on her.
Thank you. I guess a thought on in relation to the dollar amount would be maybe even a percentage versus a dollar amount, that there's two thoughts there. Secondly, I think and I can only say for me, like some of my reservations come from when we talk about particular donors, is for me, when I have read, I guess quoted from, and we'll use the union, right now the verbiage out there is like, we have to take our board back. And they're naming specific board members that have always supported them and that they can trust, and who've given respect to the teachers. And for me, on the opposite end, who's raised questions in the past that I don't either support or not support, I feel like I've kind of been in the middle. I question, their statements in relation to, the donations and how one votes only based on their direct comments. So that's why it does concern me personally. I won't speak for anybody else on the board, but where I do have some reservations in wondering if the campaign contributions are reflected on a vote. Just my thought.
Thank you. So I guess, go ahead, Member Peterson.
Well, I mean, I think statutorily, I would love to see public financing for school boards. I mean, that would be the solution.
But we
to
can't control that.
take
So
that.
what can we
It's
control?
it's something that we could take on with the legislature. Short of that, I think all of us have contributions from either individuals or organizations that others of us would find highly suspect or distasteful or not lining up with our own beliefs or intentions. And all of those impact how we vote. The issue is, did we receive those contributions with an intent to buy our vote, or did we receive those contributions because we've been very public about what our positions and our core beliefs are, and those are people who donated to us based on what our core beliefs are in the first place. And I would like to think, and this has to do, I think, going back to the guardrails that we set of not assuming ill intent in terms of our own integrity and beliefs, that we have been, each of us, public about what we believe, and we receive votes from our constituents, and we receive donations from people based on who we are and how we've represented ourselves in public over many years. And so, given that, it means that none of us could in any ethical way ever receive any contribution. So I think that we need to be careful. I need to think about what a dollar amount would be. I mean, I might be able to accept a dollar amount, although I don't think it alters my basic belief of this is not a system that fosters trust. And I would like to work on changing the system, but in the meantime, I need to think about what a dollar amount might be that I'd find reasonable.
Okay. Sticking on number 7, are there other comments, questions or suggestions?
I have a question for Mr. Melendez. So if we changed this to say that board members may recuse themselves from matters involving individuals or organizations who made contributions, so that, I mean, because then it puts back the onus on us as an individual it's our integrity that's on the line. And I like to believe that, we all come into this with a sense of integrity for sure. And absolutely, I agree with Board Member Peterson. I came into the board with a strong, I would say a strong commitment to teachers and staff and, to our staff, because I I was married to one. My mother was one. So I come with that perspective also of family members that were, part of the district. And so a real strong support for teachers and staff, but that doesn't mean that I'm bought and paid for, because I had some contributions from the PAC. That was not it at all. And I think it is up to, because I also have to serve a greater number of constituents other than just that particular group that has made a contribution to me, because my constituents in my community probably mean so far much more to me than that particular group of itself. So if it was to say board members may recuse themselves, and we still had a dollar amount on that, it still puts the onus, if I'm not correct, back on the individual themselves to call out their integrity, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Another word which is stronger is should.
But should recuse themselves, or may recuse themselves, or may disclose, or should disclose.
Well, yes. I know you're working on this, so I tried to put myself in your position when the contractor gave me a large contribution, and then the contract came before the board. I, in your shoes, would say that very night on that very issue, not everything else that's out there, I received a contribution from construction company X. And before us tonight is approval of a construction contract to this company as low bidder. I want everyone to know I received this contribution. And in that way, that very moment, there's full disclosure. And the next step is all eyes are on you. Are you going to vote yes or no, or are you going to recuse yourself? And so that's where this whole idea of disclosure to me is very important. But may, should, I've got.
Thank you. So I understand there are statutory limitations. I understand there are disclosure requirements, reporting requirements. For me, this is about holding ourselves to a higher standard. And I think the question, does the policy address real and perceived conflicts of interest? We can all sit up here and say that we're not bought by anybody. And we all receive accusations that we are bought by somebody. And in order to respond to the question around, does the policy state the presence of community confidence? In order to maintain and restore community confidence in the board as a whole, in the district as a whole, and in each of us as members, I do think it's incumbent on us to hold ourselves to that higher standard. And so I would be interested in what a conversation around what's the harm. So there's a lot of what ifs and scenarios. What if I got a donation from NAIOP or a specific contractor? What if 5 of us got that donation above $5,000? Like, we can consider all of those what ifs, but I don't want us to let those what ifs and scenarios and hurt feelings get in the way of restoring community confidence. So what is the language that we can put that will help restore that confidence, even if we're not bought, even if we're not doing anything wrong, even if we've already reported, even if we're already disclosing? How can we rebuild that trust? So for me, that's what this is really about, and why, like, how we respond to the questions that are in the evaluating governing policy manual. For me, as currently stated, this policy does not address real and perceived conflicts. It does not state the presence of community confidence. It does not prevent us or restrict us from voting or deliberating on specific issues. So what changes might we make that would make it a little stronger so we can continue to deliberate over the next couple of weeks and maybe approve a policy that helps to restore that community trust? Member Jackson.
Yeah, so that was the point I was going to make, is that it's not about union contributions. It's not about NAIOP contributions. It's not about that. It's about pulling up to a higher level and really looking at what is the primary justification for, specifically, since this is the one we're talking about, what is the primary justification for number 7? It's to restore community confidence. It's to tell our community, we recognize that campaign contributions, no matter where they come from, are going to potentially reflect a need for more disclosure. And that's why I think, again, to not obfuscate, to be very specific, to take out as much ambiguity as possible. That's where, for me, having a number that we agree on helps to bring that level of trust back up. Also, we're sitting here, we know each other, we've worked together for 2 years, but this policy lives on. And so how does this policy live on to the next board and the board after that, so that the public has, I don't want to keep using trust, but has the belief that no matter which board is sitting up there, they can trust that the decisions that we are making, no matter who contributed to us, are for the best of our students. And so it's not about me sitting next to Barb, and it's not about Peggy sitting next to Yolanda. It's about who's going to be here in 2 years and 4 years and 6 years, and how can we create that level of trust. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that in this governance manual, we do have a new area where board member concerns can be addressed. It's literally the next section where board member concerns, we lay out if there are concerns. You know, I mean, if Crystal really gets upset with me, there's a way that she can go to the board president and discuss her concerns with me about me. You should come to me first. So that's what it says in the policy. But we're creating ways that those discussions and that accountability can happen, all while being as transparent and forthright with the public as we can.
Thank you. So we've made some edits, and I don't have this in track changes because I did full screen and now I can't find my editing tools. But board members should, may, or will recuse themselves from matters involving individuals or organizations who made campaign contributions. We do want to qualify what we mean by that in some way, either with the dollar amount or with a percentage. And whether that contribution is from an individual or aggregate amounts. When there is potential for conflict of interest or perceived conflict of interest. So this is the drafty language for us to continue to deliberate on, to noodle on, and to edit. Is there any other specific edit that folks would make right now before we move on to other numbers? Member Jackson.
Right. The only thing I would suggest is Board Member Mueller-Aragon's move of make the education and well-being of students the basis for all. I would move that down as the first one.
Oh, okay. But on number 7.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. Okay. So
I was
we're good with where number 7 stands for now. We will move the this one into code of conduct. And I was, oops, yeah, that's right. Starting with on my right with Board Member Montoya Cordova to get us started. She started us on number 7. Member Mueller-Aragon, are there other things that you would like us to edit, address, discuss within the code of conduct? Oh, and I messed up the numbering now. Sorry, because I added that one.
So we're on number.
Well, anything within the code of conduct, when you reviewed it, are there any edits or changes that you would want to make? Propose.
I can't think of anything else. I mean, I'm still just uncomfortable with still number 7, but
Okay.
I just am. So
Member Peterson, any other of these numbers here in the code of conduct that you would want to discuss or make edits to based on the questions that are in the evaluating governing policies document?
Not at this moment. I might come back to it because I'm still contemplating number 7.
Okay.
And again, I mean, not to beat a dead horse. I think that it's very unclear about on what basis, by whom will it be enforced? You know, all of those issues. I think that it's that vagueness that doesn't sit well. Because again, are we going to use this to have a majority of the board silence the minority of the board? And I think that's the potential that it leaves wide open.
So as you're noodling and submitting edits, if there's anything around the enforcement piece that you think would be helpful to add to the board member performance concerns or elsewhere in the governing manual, because we are self-policing, we are monitoring ourselves. So think about that as well.
I will do that.
And Member Jackson, were there any others in here that you wanted to discuss or edit?
Just one edit is potentially where it says board member code of conduct and this is conflict of interest. I think we can X out conflict of interest because that was kind of more just a placeholder of what that's discussing. So I would X that out. And the only one I kind of have a question on whether or not we should keep it or not is it's now turned into number 9, but it's not give operational advice or instruction to staff members. Because I wonder if that is kind of in our guardrail about the delegation being to the superintendent. So I don't know if that's redundant. I'm going to suspect that Ashley might say that it should stay in, but I don't know if it needs to stay in.
Because it seems to me like our board work clearly tells us that we don't give operational advice or instruction to staff members.
Right.
So I'm with you on that
So I
one too.
wonder if it's
Yes.
redundant to have that in there.
Can you put that in as a comment? Because I don't have.
I'd be
a comment
happy
button.
to, yes.
Large screen. Okay. Member Tapia Romero, were there other numbers, clauses, issues within this code of conduct that you want to discuss or edit?
No, nothing that hasn't already been said. Thank you.
Thank you. For me, I know I messed up the numbering. So it was 5, 6, and 9. I felt could be, which are now 6, 7, and 10, could be collapsed. So 6 kind of goes through disclosure of potential conflicts of interest. 7 says that we'll complete a conflict of interest disclosure form on an annual basis. I think that can be combined or is maybe already mentioned in 6. And then what's now 10, which was originally 9, will update this if a new financial interest occurs, which is also kind of already in here. Shall notify the executive director. So I think we can cut 2 of them by collapsing them because they're repetitive
Collapse 7 and 10
into 6. Okay. So we have discussed guardrails, code of ethics, and code of conduct. We've captured the edits. These will come back to us for the October 2nd policy committee meeting, along with further legal review and advice and opinions. And we are ready to move on to our next agenda item, which is still in discussion items, item 4.3. Our next item for discussion is next steps for the policy review and diet. So let me stop screen sharing.
So I just want a point of clarification. So our next policy meeting is October the 2nd?
Yes, because this one was supposed to be September 3rd and it got pushed back twice.
And I'm okay, just concerned because I know I'll try my best to be part of that. I'm going to be out of town. This is really important and I feel like I have to vote on this one. So I got to see if I can be able to do it from Portland. And board member Mula Aragon, you're going to also be out potentially.
Likely I won't be here either. It's my 42nd anniversary, my 41st anniversary.
Just a
Better
really-
not say
it's an
42nd.
important- It's an
41st.
important vote. And
So we can take that up with board services, whether we move the vote or move the meeting to make sure we can accommodate as many members as possible.
okay.
Okay, thank you for flagging that.
But I'll just point out that the following week is Monday is Columbus
Board services
Day.
can handle the schedule.
Yeah. But there are issues with moving it to the next week.
Okay. So policy review and diet. So to bring you up to speed, the ad hoc policy review committee, which is myself and member Peterson, met a couple of times. We reviewed a rubric that was a 0 to 10 rubric, which essentially with the low end 0 and 1 are policies that are primarily or entirely administrative, require administrative expertise and management responsibility. The other end, the 10 of the rubric, is policies that require board governance expertise and responsibility. After reviewing every single policy on our books, we ranked them, and 45% of our policies fell below 5, so ranked a 4 or below. So we also looked at, of those 45% of policies, which are administrative responsibilities, we coded which ones are also legally required by us by law for us to have. So the next step is that that Ms. Martinez, our policy analyst, has already started, is going through those 0 through 4s. And she's going to put them into a packet, which will be reviewed by cabinet for discussion. And they will also weigh in on how they feel about whether those move to an administrative manual or whether they stay as a board policy. Based on that discussion, they'll then come to us in a subsequent policy committee meeting, hopefully in the next one or so, but it's going to depend on workload and timing and scheduling and everything else. And we will review that in a group, a bunch of all of those policies, and we'll decide if we feel okay moving them into administrative manual. And so if it's a policy that was 4 or below, not required by law, that is a administrative responsibility, superintendent responsibility, it becomes essentially a procedural directive, and they have responsibility for it. It doesn't come to us anymore. As an example, I mentioned there were 45% of our policies which fall in this category. There were a lot of things that, and try to do the list, that fall. So investments is an example. We're required by law to have that, but it's not really something that requires our action per se on a regular basis. And so how can that be managed by the administration? There's one on energy and water conservation. There's one on school bus drivers and district vehicles, personal electronic devices in district vehicles. These are not things that are related to our goals or our student outcomes, but are under the purview of the superintendent and the administration. So those will move into administrative manual. If you recall the way that we did the special ed policies, they were sort of presented to us as strike throughs. And then there was a new special ed manual created that the special ed department now manages. So it's going to kind of look like that. And we're going to do it in a chunk, taking, starting with the zeros through twos, which are going to go through cabinet first. And then again, depending on workload, we'll get to the 3s and 4s. Because there are many policies that are required by law, we will maintain those policies on our books. We will update them as necessary as legislation changes, as we're required to update them. But the guidance from SOFG is that we update those in consent. So if we're required to have a policy on water conservation, and it's required to be reviewed every 2 years, I'm just making this up, it'll stay as a policy, but it'll be on our consent agenda. So that's sort of what the next step for the policy work is. We don't know the right word for how we categorize those below fives that are legally required. So the only word I could think of was like appendix. It would be like an appendix to our board policies, or just another section of our board policies that we maintain. But again, we're not really addressing them, reviewing them frequently. Legacy list is what they're called. Okay. Legacy list is what those policies are called. So let me go back to my notes because I'm on a different page now. I think that is everything with the policy review committee. Did I miss anything? Okay, are there any questions about that?
I'll just add that some of those policies that really should not be policies, they are not in our lap, may still have some implications for student outcomes, but that's what the superintendent presents to us. So that if, for instance, related to goal 4, there's something about attendance and transportation impacts attendance, then maybe a policy about bus drivers and phones might be an appropriate procedural. This is far-fetched, but it might be something that we want to hear something about sometime, like the special ed manual or the driver procedural directive stuff, but only as it relates to one of our goals or guardrails. It's not in our lap. I have no idea what the qualifications of a bus driver are. I just know that the superintendent and his designees do.
Great. So so those will be coming forth. Maybe some on the next policy committee meeting, maybe not, but probably the 0s through 2s. So keep an eye out for that. Yeah, that's that. Okay. Our next item is the chair report. So the policy committee is scheduled to meet again on Monday, October 2nd at 5 p.m. tentatively. We're going to look into, again, reviewing the agenda and the timing here in the boardroom at the Alice and Bruce King Educational Complex. During that meeting, which will be live streamed on the APS Board of Education YouTube channel, we will continue the work from this evening. So what that is, that will be considering committee approval of the board guardrails. So we edited them. They'll come back to us in our board packet before that meeting, and we'll have additional opportunity to edit. And then we're going to ideally vote during that next meeting. If they pass, then they'll go to the consent agenda of a subsequent board meeting, which I think is October 18th, but it doesn't have to be that one. And they will also be incorporated into the board governance manual, which will also come before the committee for a vote. So we went through cutting the code of ethics, keeping the code of conduct, and discussed potential changes to that. So again, review the governance manual, and any other changes that you would like to propose to that, also email into board services. Again, you'll also have the deadline along with the packet that comes shortly for that October 2nd meeting. The goal is, again, to vote on that full governance manual in committee because it has policies in it. It becomes our policy, and that'll also go to the full board meeting for consent. This committee will also begin I already said this part. I guess this was also just in the policy review diet. The committee will also begin discussing policies that may not be considered board work, but are more appropriately considered administrative procedures. So as I just said, the 0s and 2s will come to us for repeal, essentially, and being moved into the administrative manual. So along with the first read of the budget draft, we'll also continue to move that budget policy. So it's a lot of work ahead of us. We've also done a whole lot already. I know it's challenging. And as I said, it's juicy, it's controversial sometimes, but it's rewarding. And I think it's what our community expects of us. So we will continue to keep the focus on student outcomes and continue to move these issues forward. And with that, we are adjourned.